Great. Thank you, Catherine. Can everyone hear me? And yeah, great. Good. So I'm here to talk about infant-directed speech across time and space and to present some findings from a recent meta-analysis that we did on the properties of infant-directed speech. So just a quick overview of the talk to begin with. I'll start out. So here are examples of caregivers interacting with their infants and situations where we might expect them to speak with infant-directed speech. And I'll start out by providing some background on infant-directed speech. So talk about what it is and what we mean by infant-directed speech. And then talk about, well, why do adults and caregivers actually modify their speech to infants? What purpose does it serve? Does it serve various functions during infant development? We'll then turn to the study that we did, which asked two main questions. So this is the meta-analysis. And we started out by asking questions about space. So do different languages express infant-directed speech with different properties? And then also about time. So do the properties of infant-directed speech change as the infant grows older? And this second question we use also to tell us about functions, or we investigate whether this can tell us anything about the functions of infant-directed speech during development. Great. So let's start from the start and ask probably the most basic question we can, which is what is infant-directed speech? And at its most basic level, right, it's a speech style that caregivers use to address and interact with young infants. And you may have heard of child-directed speech, which is the same, except we use infant-directed speech to refer to infants that are a bit younger, so between 0 months and 24 months of age. And a useful way to construe infant-directed speech is as a sort of a sense of accommodation to the linguistic immaturity of the infant. So infant-directed speech might help caregivers to express emotions and to express their intentions to linguistically immature infants. So in this sense, it's about creating an emotional communion between the caregiver and the infant in the process of interaction. And we should also note that infant-directed speech is also accompanied by a variety of other things. So exaggerated facial expressions and exaggerated gestures, they all form part of this speech style, you could say. Yes, and one of the interesting things about infant-directed speech is that we have quite strong intuitions about this speech style. And I thought I would put this to the test to start out with. So I'll play you two speech samples, A and B. And it's your job to tell me which one is infant-directed and which one is adult-directed. So we'll start with the first one.
What do you think? Can we roll the ball?
Yeah, you can put it on your head like a hat. It's got white stars, there's 50.
Okay, and here comes speech sample B.
Slightly bigger, but squishy in the same way. It's just a blue kind of basketball.
Okay, so if you put your hand up if you think speech sample A was infant-directed. Okay, I can see some of you on the screen, but most of you are putting your hand up, indicating that that it's infant-directed, and indeed it was. And this is this highlights something interesting about infant-directed speech, right? Because this speech sample is from US English, and the majority of us, as we saw in the Mentimeter quiz, are from the British Isles. Meaning that we can recognize that a given speech sample is infant-directed, even if it's not our variety of English. And this brings us to my next point of looking at infant-directed speech across cultures. And if we look at infant-directed speech, so I'll refer to this as IDS in the remainder of this presentation. But if we look across cultures and across languages, we see these striking similarities in terms of their properties. So both in terms of the acoustics, meaning like the sound properties of the speech style. We see an elevated pitch, a slower articulation rate in a lot of these languages of the world. We also see similarities in terms of the structural features of infant-directed speech, which is so shorter utterances, we see simplified vocabulary and so forth. And here's a map from the paper, so the meta-analysis of infant-directed speech. And here we show a map of all of the languages for which IDS has been investigated. So the languages with orange dots have been investigated for infant-directed speech, and the ones in blue have not been investigated for infant-directed speech. And we see here a clear pattern or a clear bias in terms of the languages that have been investigated. So we see US English has a big orange dot, Canadian English, New Zealand English, and we see a lot of the European languages, so Germanic languages and Romance languages, sort of overrepresented in studies that have been conducted on IDS, infant-directed speech. And I'll return to this point later on in the presentation. Okay. So we see these striking similarities in terms of the acoustic and structural features of infant-directed speech, but we see quite a lot of cross-cultural variation in the quantity of IDS, so how much caregivers actually use infant-directed speech. So some recent studies on the quantity of infant-directed speech have been conducted by Casillas and Bergelson and colleagues, where they looked at a Mayan culture in Mexico, and they found that caregivers addressed their infants with infant-directed speech only about 3.5 minutes per hour. And this is quite striking in terms of when we compare this to US English, where they receive almost 3 times as much infant-directed speech during development. So these results suggest that infant-directed speech is this continuum that exhibits variability both in how it sounds, so in terms of its properties, in terms of its sound properties, but also in the amount it's actually used. Yes. And now we've talked a bit about the properties of infant-directed speech and how widespread it is, but we also need to think a bit about the functions of infant-directed speech. So the question is, why do we actually modify our speech to infants? And the fact that it's so widespread across distinct languages and cultures suggests that it might serve some functions during development. And researchers have proposed 3 main functions. So the first of which is that infant-directed speech might help caregivers communicate emotions and intentions better. It may also engage infant attention in a more effective way. So I have a graph here from a multi-lab study of infant-directed speech, where they looked at the extent to which infants prefer to listen to infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech. And here a positive number indicates that they prefer to listen to infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. And this graph shows that infants actually show a linear increase, right, from 4 months to 14 months, that they actually prefer to listen to infant-directed speech. So this suggests that if you really want to grab infants' attention, then infant-directed speech is the way to go. Okay, a third function of infant-directed speech is that it might facilitate linguistic development. It might make the task of learning language easier. Yes. And common to all 3 of these functions of infant-directed speech is that it arises from the interaction between the caregiver and the infant. So the caregiver is reacting to the infant's responses and the infant is reacting to the caregiver responses. It's a very important point, that it arises in the interaction between the caregiver and the infant. Over the course of development, we also see a shift in terms of infants' preferences for certain properties in the speech style. So we see that younger infants prefer positive emotions in the speech style, whereas older infants prefer to attend to the linguistic information. They don't care much about the emotional content of the speech. So now we'll turn to the study and talk a bit about how we investigated infant-directed speech. And we conducted a large-scale meta-analysis. And the main point of a meta-analysis is to synthesize the evidence on a given topic. So meta-analyses specifically use quantitative results from studies that have already been conducted that address similar questions. So in our case, the properties of infant-directed speech. And here's a diagram of how meta-analyses work. So researchers conduct studies on a given group of participants, and these researchers then publish a study. And a meta-analysis pools together all of these results from all these individual studies that have been conducted to synthesize the evidence on a given topic. So our meta-analysis looks at 30 to 40 years of research into the properties of infant-directed speech, and we look at, or we synthesize evidence from 88 studies, 734 estimates, so results from these studies, and these studies actually comprise 33 distinct languages. So it's a very big endeavor that we embarked on. And as I said, these results are synthesized in using robust statistical methods. Yes. And in order to standardize the measures, so because different studies use different measures, we calculated something called an effect size. And what an effect size is basically asking how different are infant-directed speech properties and adult-directed speech properties. So we're quantifying the difference between these two speech styles in terms of their properties, their sound properties. So here a positive effect size means a higher value in IDS than in ADS, so adult-directed speech, and vice versa. And this will become more clear when I go through the results. So in a sense, we're quantifying how we're using adult-directed speech as a baseline and then quantifying the extent to which IDS exaggerates certain properties in relation to adult-directed speech. Okay. Now, some of the main aims of this meta-analysis were to investigate how IDS differs across languages. So do different languages express infant-directed speech differently? And then also how the properties of infant-directed speech change with infant age. So to what extent do we speak to older infants in a different way than to younger infants, for example? And we also asked these questions in order to better understand the functions of IDS. So the title of this slide is a form-function correspondence. So by looking at the form of speech, right, by looking at the properties of infant-directed speech, we aim to better understand the functions of infant-directed speech, because there is this correspondence between form and function. Okay. So we looked at four main properties of infant-directed speech. So we looked at pitch, which is known to be elevated in infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. We also looked at pitch variability. So we use more melodic phrases in infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. We looked at speech rate, which is slower in infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. And then we looked at vowel space area, which is perhaps the most unintuitive concept of these four properties. And there's a great introductory video on vowel space area made by Ben on the website, but I'll go through the vowel space area measure quickly here. So the idea is that caregivers they exaggerate the distinctions between vowel categories in their infant-directed speech. So this would be the vowel space area of adult-directed speech, so normal speech. But in infant-directed speech, caregivers have been shown to exaggerate the distinctions between these individual vowel categories. So this measure has been claimed to be a measure of the extent to which caregivers clarify their speech to infants. Great. So we have certain expectations, or we had certain expectations about the functions of infant-directed speech and whether we could see them in the form of infant-directed speech. So based on the literature that we just reviewed as well, there's a tendency to think about infant-directed speech as first serving socio-emotional functions, so being about communicating intentions, and then at a later point in development serving linguistic functions, so allowing the infant to acquire the speech faster. And if we have this expectation about the function of infant-directed speech, we would expect to see a decrease in the emotional properties of the speech style and to see an increase in the linguistic properties of the speech style. So as the infant grows older and starts to produce and understand speech to a greater extent, we might expect caregivers to subconsciously exaggerate the linguistic properties of the speech style. Great. So now we can look at some of the results. And the overall pattern in the results is that some of the acoustic features exhibit change. So here we have a graph of pitch. So all of these gray dots are the individual estimates from individual studies. And we can see here that generally we see pitch decreasing over the course of early infant development. So the effect size becomes closer to 0 as the infant grows older. So this indicates that caregivers produce a less exaggerated pitch in infant-directed speech as the infant grows older. Similarly, with articulation rate, we see a negative effect size, indicating that caregivers are producing slower speech in infant-directed speech And as the infant grows older, they produce gradually faster speech. Great. Now, other acoustic features exhibit stability. So if we look at pitch variability, we see simply a straight line. So as the infant grows older, from between 0 and 36 months of age, we see the pitch variability of infant-directed speech being the same. So they continue to exaggerate pitch variability in infant-directed speech when compared to adult-directed speech. Similarly, for vowel space area, we see this stable line, so indicating that caregivers exaggerate the vowels even as the infants grow older. Yes. And here's another graph showing the effect sizes with colors. So the more orange the square, the stronger the effect size. And here we'll look at the same acoustic properties. So if we look at pitch here, we see that almost all of the squares here are orange. So across all of these distinct languages, from Australian English to US English, we see quite strong patterns of exaggerating pitch for these languages. Similarly, for pitch variability, we see more moderate effect sizes. So they're not as orange as the ones we see to the left. But for pitch variability, we see similarly that caregivers tend to exaggerate the pitch variability in their infant-directed speech in all of these distinct languages. Now, lastly, or not lastly yet, but for vowel space area, we see that some languages show quite strong effects, exaggerating distinctions between vowels, but we also see language specificity. So for Cantonese Chinese, for Danish and for Dutch, we actually see very weak effect sizes, indicating that in these languages, caregivers don't exaggerate the differences between the individual vowel categories. And lastly, for articulation rate, we see a lot of blue squares, indicating that these are negative effect sizes, and these show quite strong effects across all the distinct languages that we can see here. And here, a final visualization of the results. So pitch on the left, we see US English up here and US English over here, indicating that these show strong effects indicating the pitch and pitch variability show quite strong effects for US English. And this relates to the point I had about the bias in terms of the languages that have been investigated for infant-directed speech, which I'll be happy to take questions on afterwards. Great. So we can ask then, well, what have we learned by conducting this meta-analysis? What have we learned by synthesizing the evidence on infant-directed speech? And partly we've learned that, so across space, right, across distinct languages, we have quite strong evidence for these universal tendencies in the properties of infant-directed speech, in how IDS sounds across languages. So this is the reason why we can identify US English speech as being infant-directed or adult-directed, right? Because we're all using the same acoustic features to express this speech style. And then we also have across time, we see dynamic changes in infant-directed speech as the infants grow older, right? So certain properties change and other properties remain stable according to the abilities and needs of the infant. Okay, and what we can conclude from this is that is also that some IDS properties might be language specific, right? So we saw that vowel space area showed more language specificity than, for example, pitch or pitch variability or articulation rate. But we can also maybe conclude that caregivers might adjust their speech to scaffold infants' development. So the fact that we see these dynamic changes in terms of the properties of infant-directed speech might indicate that caregivers are responding to the needs and abilities of their infants. So as infants become more linguistically mature, they're also adapting their speech style to suit those needs. Great. And I didn't conduct this work alone, so I'd like to say thank you to all of my collaborators and supervisors, and thank you for listening.